We're going to study Matthew 24, 1 to 42, and I'll look at a few other verses after that, share some thoughts there, and then Lord willing, when we finish, this will be 2 or 3 weeks, I think 3, and then we'll take a look at the book of Revelation, which will be a long time. That'll take maybe 6 months, I don't know. Now, Matthew 24, it reports teaching of the Lord Jesus delivered to his disciples just a few days before his crucifixion. And because that teaching was delivered on the Mount of Olives, this teaching is commonly referred to as the Olivet Discourse. That's why it's called that. It's where it was delivered. As I say, after we look at Matthew 24 and a few other texts, that I'll share some thoughts about some few other texts that relate to his coming, and then we'll move on to Revelation. Now there is, as you probably know, there's much disagreement among scholars regarding the interpretation of Matthew 24 and its parallels in Mark chapter 13 and Luke chapter 21. And we're going to be concentrating on Matthew chapter 24. And no approach to these texts is free from difficulties. In other words, there's no interpretation you can look at and say, that's a no-brainer, that's the interpretation. Okay, they're all interpretations of these texts have some issues they have to deal with. But what I'm going to present to you, as I always do, is the understanding that makes the most sense to me. Okay, for what you think that's worth, that's what I'm going to give you, the understanding that makes the most sense to me. And though I've added my take on certain points and some wrinkles, the view that I'm going to present to you is essentially that of the noted New Testament scholar D.A. Carson. So that's where I've learned some of these things from, and that view is shared, at least in its key elements, by some other well-known New Testament scholars. For example, Leon Morris and Craig Blomberg. So it's by no means eccentric, okay? What I'm teaching you is not exotic, it's not weird, it's evangelical mainstream, okay? That doesn't mean it's the only interpretation. But I just want you to know I'm not leading you down some bizarro path, okay? Now let's start. Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 to 3. It says, he's looking a little hard to see. Jesus left the temple and was, maybe I'll read it off here. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these things, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the close of the age?" Now, in Jesus' day, the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, it was an awesome structure. King Solomon, of course, he built the first temple in the middle of the 10th century, began it in 966, worked on it for 7 years. So he builds the first temple in the middle of the 10th century BC, and that temple was destroyed by the Babylonians when they conquered Israel, Judah. It was destroyed in 587 or 586 BC. And after Cyrus the Persian, after he conquered the Babylonians in 539 BC and then allowed the Jews to return, Zerubbabel and a group of Israelites, they returned to Jerusalem and completed the building of the second temple in 516 BC. They laid the foundation shortly after they got back to Jerusalem, but they didn't complete the building of the temple till 516 BC. So we have middle of the 10th century, then centuries later it's destroyed. Then in 516, it's rebuilt. That's the second temple. And then we come down many years, centuries later, 20 BC, Herod the Great. So he's the king who later sought to kill the infant Jesus. Herod the Great in 20 BC, he announced a plan to renovate the temple. And that plan began the next year with his assembling, in 19 BC, with his assembling of the building materials that would be necessary for the plan that he had. And that task, just the assembling of the building materials, took 8 years. And so you see, this is a massive project. And it transformed the temple area into what at the time was the largest man-made structure on earth. So Herod, he greatly extended the platform on which the temple was built. He greatly built that out. He increased its area to about 36 acres, which is roughly 27 football fields. Now that's a sizable platform. And the platform, it really was the roof. That's what this platform is. It's really the roof of a multi-story structure of arches and vaults that extended out from the mountain peak, Mount Moriah. And so you have, here's this mountain peak, and then you have this roof of this multi-story structure of arches and vaults. So it's the platform is really the roof. And here you can see is a cutaway of what someone thinks, based on journeys through what are called the rabbinic temples under the platform. They think this is what you would see if you cut away the southeast corner. And so you can see here the multi-stories up here, and so the platform is the roof of that structure. And you get some idea of how large it is. And the platform included huge courtyards. Here's a model of what it's thought to have looked like. But it included huge courtyards with the temple complex being right in the center there. And that complex, it included the temple proper. Okay, so you have, right here, you have the temple proper, it included that, but it included all of these buildings around it, these auxiliary buildings that were there. So there's more than simply the temple proper. And you can see that there. And much of that work was completed by the time of King Herod's death. King Herod died, most people accept his death as 4 BC. And that's an oddity. So then Jesus is born in like 5 BC or 6 BC, and that's kind of quirky. Okay, but I've talked about that before. Some people want to argue that Herod died in 1 BC, but most people accept he died in 4 BC. Most of that temple was completed by the time of his death, but it remained a construction site. Things were still being done on that temple complex until AD 63. So this was a huge, long building thing. And in chapter 2 of Matthew 24, Jesus, he pronounces doom on the temple. Okay, so that's why they came running up to him. So you see these magnificent buildings. This truly was magnificent. But Jesus there, he pronounces doom on the temple, as he indicated in Matthew chapter 23, verses 37 and 38. The fate of the temple and of Israel nationally is determined by Israel's response to him, or more specifically, by Israel's rejection of him. You see here it says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you are not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate." And in Luke chapter 19, verses 41 to 44, there you see he weeps over Jerusalem. And he says that the city's coming destruction is because the Jewish leaders and most of the people refuse to receive him for who he is. They refused to receive him. They did not recognize the time of their visitation by God in the flesh. So he's God incarnate. He's come to them as the promised Messiah, and they reject him. No, he says here, when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, Would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace, but now they're hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you. And they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time. In other words, because they rejected him as he offered them life, God in the flesh. And the disciples, they assume, this is important to get in understanding here in the parallel text. The disciples assume, their thinking is that the destruction of the temple, that it occurs in conjunction with the end of the age, the time when God judges and remakes the world, an event that they associate with some kind of dramatic coming of Jesus. Now, that's an important thing to understand, that they associate the destruction of the temple with the end time. They see it as an end time phenomenon. And there are many scholars, so that's important, and I want you to see that I'm not making that up. For example, Craig Blomberg, in his commentary, Blomberg says Jesus will make clear that the destruction of the temple and the end of the age are two separate events. The disciples think they're one. He will make clear to them that they are, in fact, two separate events. But probably the disciples did not yet recognize this, scarcely imagining that one could occur without the other. Hence, for them, the two questions are one and the same. When will this occur? What's the sign of your coming at the end of the age? They're one and the same. I. Howard Marshall, in a commentary on Luke, he says, Jesus' hearers may be presumed to have regarded the destruction of the temple as an eschatological event. Okay? Eschatological, end time. They may be presumed, that's how they're thinking. When they hear Jesus speak of the destruction of the temple, they see that as something that's tied up with the end. So he's speaking about the end. David Garland, he says, they clearly connect the temple's destruction to the end time, for they see it as the center of their narrow universe. And George Ladd, he says in his theology of the New Testament, Ladd says, there can be little doubt but that the disciples thought of the destruction of the temple as one of the events accompanying the end of the age and the coming of the eschatological, the final state, the end time kingdom of God. So when they hear Jesus talking about this temple's going to be destroyed, they're thinking that's the end. They're thinking it's the end. Now, Matthew 23, verse 39, you have here where it says, for I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So that's the verse right before Matthew 24. That probably is the trigger for their reference to his coming. What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? They're not thinking, almost certainly they're not thinking at this point in terms of a post-resurrection return. That's not what they're thinking of at this point, because those disciples did not appreciate or anticipate the resurrection, right? They didn't think about that. The resurrection surprised them. So you say, well, what return are they thinking about? I think they're thinking of some kind of dramatic coming. What kind of coming are they thinking about? They're thinking of some kind of dramatic coming that will be a pivot point, a turning point in the fate of Israel. Perhaps Jesus coming in the power of the Spirit as an earthly king to vanquish all opposition. You see, what's going to be the sign of your coming when all of this stuff will then take off and occur? So I don't think at this point that they're thinking of a post-resurrection return, because they're not thinking of a resurrection. That was still something that surprised them. But of course, by the time the Gospel of Matthew is written, which is decades later, their question would then be understood in the way that Jesus undoubtedly answered it, as a reference to his post-resurrection return in glory to consummate the kingdom of God that he inaugurated with his first coming. Okay, so when they speak of coming, I think at that time that they're thinking of some kind of turning point, maybe coming in the power of the Spirit as an earthly king, something like that. But when it's read later in the gospel, it's going to be seen as, no, by coming they mean a post-resurrection, which is how Jesus clearly answers it. Okay? Now, because they understand the end in their mind, their way of thinking, they understand the end to involve the destruction of the temple. Jesus' reference to that event, Jesus' reference to the destruction of the temple, it prompts them to ask, when the end? When the complex, the suite, the set of eschatological events of which the temple's destruction was a part, these things, plural. You see, it prompts them to ask when this complex of eschatological events, when that will occur. And that question of when will the end occur that you're talking about when you talk about the destruction of the temple? And that question of when is then clarified in terms of the signs that will immediately precede the end. When will this happen, and what will be the signs of the end? That's what they're wanting to know. As Blomberg noted in that quote that I read a moment ago, for the disciples, the two questions are the same. See, when will the end be, and what will be the sign of the end? What will be the sign of your coming and the close of the age? Their interest, the disciples' interest, is not in the destruction of the temple per se. It's not there. It's not in the destruction of the temple per se, but in the coming of the end as represented in their minds by the destruction of the temple. You see, because they relate the two. And the form of the question that they ask, that form varies somewhat in the differing accounts. The form of the question varies, with Matthew giving the fullest expression of the question they ask. Now, regarding the differences in the question between Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, D.A. Carson, he says, yet if we make the reasonable assumption that in the disciples' mind, their question as to the temple's destruction and the signs that will presage it are linked to the end of the age and Jesus' return, and I say here more precisely Jesus' coming, if we understand that, then there's little problem in integrating the questions from Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. Once you see that, he says Matthew makes explicit what was implicit and what Jesus recognized as implicit in their question. So when you look to match up how they're doing, that will be helpful to you. Now, this is key to seeing how the accounts in the Gospels, how they correspond to each other. As in Matthew, the focus of the disciples' question in Mark and Luke, albeit implicitly, but the focus of their question is on the coming of the end that they see represented in Jesus' statement about the destruction of the temple. Okay, I'm harping on that because it's important for you to get, both not only for Matthew 24, but also when you go and look at the corresponding accounts. All right, verses 4 to 8. He says, and Jesus answered them, see that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. all these are but the beginning of birth pains. They're but the beginning of birth pains. So Jesus addresses their question about the coming of the end by warning them not to be led astray during the time until the end. Don't be led astray during the time until the end. Before the end comes, many will claim his title Christ, the Anointed One, or more generally, will claim to be specially anointed deliverers of God. Many will claim to be saviors, the pathway to something. Until the end, there's going to be many people who will make this claim, and they will deceive people and get them to put their trust in them. They will be false. But this is something that will happen until the end. And he also commands them not to be alarmed when the end does not come in association with some particular war or famine or earthquake that raises expectations of the end. I'll explain to you how I get to that statement. That's what he's warning them about. All these things will occur without the arrival of the end. These things are all going to happen, and the end is not going to come in association with them. They will happen without the arrival of the end. They are but the beginning of birth pains. The beginning of that period of distress of unspecified duration. They are but the beginning of birth pains, the beginning of that period of distress of unspecified duration that precedes the end, that precedes the consummation at the Lord's return. D.A. Carson speaks of birth pains, and he says, birth pains in this context stems from such OT passages as Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah. By this time, it was almost a special term for the birth pangs of the Messiah, the period of distress preceding the Messianic age. You see, the understanding that before the Lord comes, before the Messiah comes, there's going to be this tumult, like birth pains, and they will then give rise. Then the Messiah will come. Okay, so this is the idea of these birth pains. They're not of the Messiah, they're the birth pains that precede his delivery, his arrival, his coming. And so that's how it's used. Michael Wilkins, in his commentary, he says, the metaphor in birth pains is used to highlight that the onset of childbirth is not steady, but is a repeated phenomenon, coming in waves over and over again. The baby does not come on the first pang, but once the pains begin, all know that the inexorable process has commenced. We do not know if the baby will come on the 5th, 15th, 50th, or 500th. Periods of war and rumors of war, tragic earthquakes and famines wash over the landscape of history in repeated pains. Each reminds us that the end is coming, but no one knows when until the Son of Man appears. Throughout the labor, we must be on guard. So this is this idea of these birth pains. And the disciples are thinking, they're thinking of the end arriving in conjunction with some kind of conflict that brings the destruction of Jerusalem. This is their mindset, that's going to be tied up with the end. And Jesus tells them not to be alarmed when they hear of wars and rumors of wars, because, okay, don't be alarmed when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, because things like conflicts between nations and other upheavals like famines and earthquakes, they all will occur without the arrival of the end. Without the arrival of the end. Turner says in his commentary, he says, but real and rumored warfare, earthquakes and famine should not frighten the disciples because these things do not signify the end. Again, those things are only the beginning of birth pains, not the arrival of the end, not the delivery at the end of a long sequence of birth pains. You see, now this says to me, all right, as I read this, this says to me that the alarm that Jesus is forestalling, the alarm that Jesus is alleviating, is an alarm that's tied to the expectation that the end would arrive in conjunction with some particular conflict or upheaval. Otherwise, it makes no sense to give as a reason they should not be alarmed that these conflicts and upheavals will occur without the end arriving. You see, I mean, it's tied to their idea that the end is going to arrive. Otherwise, how do you relieve or alleviate by telling them, hey, the end's not going to come then? So you have to see that their alarm is somehow tied to that. For example, if the alarm that he's talking about, if the alarm was simply over the distress that war brings, all of the suffering and all of that war brings, well, the fact that wars will happen without the coming of the end, that would be irrelevant to relieving that alarm, right? That's not what I'm alarmed about. I'm alarmed about the suffering that's inherent in war. Don't worry about it. The end won't come then. Well, that's not what I'm concerned about, the suffering. So do you see that the alarm is tied to their expectation of the end coming in relation to some specific suffering or harm, war, some disaster, some upheaval. And that's why he relieves that alarm by telling them, don't be alarmed, because the end is in fact not coming in conjunction with that. It's just the beginning of the birth pains. In fact, you would exacerbate the alarm. If somebody's simply concerned about the suffering that's inherent in war, and that's what the alarm's about, well, you're not going to alleviate it by telling them the end's not coming. You're going to exacerbate it, because at least then I could say, well, the end's coming. I'm suffering now, but I got the end. He then says, no, you don't. So what's going on? What is he after? Jesus says, do not be alarmed by wars, famines, and earthquakes, because those things will happen without the coming of the end. Then you say, but why would they be alarmed? Why would they be alarmed if they thought those things would be accompanied by the end? Right? Clearly they're thinking there's a connection. They're thinking that something's accompanied by the end, so that to say the end is not coming relieves that alarm. But why would they think? You see, why in the world would they be alarmed if they thought those things they're experiencing would be accompanied by the end? How would that be alarming? I mean, how would thinking that some upheaval or some conflict or some war or some suffering, how would thinking that that would be ushering in the end generate alarm? Right? Certainly they wouldn't be alarmed at the coming of the end, right? They wouldn't be alarmed at that. They're disciples, and they are to look forward to the redemption of that day. As you see in Luke chapter 21, verse 27 and 28. He says, and then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and glory. Now, when these things begin to take place, straighten up and raise your heads. See, when the end comes, I'm happy. Right? He says, straighten up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. It's here. Right? So it can't be the coming of the end itself, right? Indeed, Christians, we pray, Maranatha. We pray for the Lord's coming. Come, Lord Jesus. 1 Corinthians 16:22, Revelation 22, verse 20. And we long for his appearing, 2 Timothy 4:8. You see, so the alarm that is connected with their thinking that the end is going to come is not an alarm that is tied to the coming of the end itself, because we long for that. That's not a source of alarm. You see, what's going on, I'm convinced, is the expectation that certain upheavals will be accompanied by the end. That creates alarm if the end does not happen in conjunction with those upheavals. In other words, if I have a false idea that this signals the end, as you've seen religious groups through history say, this will be the end, this will be the end, what happens? Well, it didn't happen. Well, that creates alarm. Why does it create alarm? Because now I'm saying, the end isn't coming. No, this was going to be the end. This is it. It's tied to this particular upheaval, this war, this famine, whatever it is, this birth pain. This is the one. And it doesn't happen. Well, now I'm alarmed. You see, the end isn't coming because I falsely connected the end to some specific birth pain. And I think Jesus is trying to relieve that alarm by telling them, don't do that, because there's going to be all kinds of birth pains until the end, and you will have no way of knowing. You see, all kinds of spikes, all kinds of birth pains that will happen. He's telling them not to be alarmed when, contrary to their expectation, the end does not come in conjunction with some conflict or upheaval. There will be many birth pains prior to the arrival of the end. So do not fret its failure to arrive after some particular birth pain, after some specific conflict or hardship or war or famine or whatever it is. This reality is convulsing that will ultimately lead to the arrival of the Son, his birth, so to speak, in that sense. All right, 9 to 14. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So during the period of time until the end, you see, when he says then, taken as at that time, not thereafter. You see, then can have two meanings, right? Then means at that time. Or you could say it's after that. Well, the way to understand it here is at that time. See, during the period of time until the end, during this period of birth pains, Christians will be persecuted and killed and will be hated throughout the world because of their allegiance to Christ. That's what's going to happen. And during that period, many will fall away under the heat, under the pressure. They will turn. They will seek to devour their fellow brothers and sisters. It says, many will fall away and betray and hate one another, and many false prophets will arise and deceive many. They will come out with all kinds of ideas. I've got the new thing. I'm somebody here. This is going to happen. This will characterize this period until the end. This is the age that we're living in. There's going to be an increase in wickedness, and the love of many will grow cold. Only those who endure to the end in the face of these trying circumstances. Only those who endure to the end in the face of these trying circumstances will be saved. And despite those circumstances that he's outlined, the gospel will be preached throughout the whole world. Only at the end of this time of birth pains. Okay? Only at the end of this time of birth pains. This period of undefined length, only then will the end come. Only then. And the distress of the inter-Advent period, the distress of the church age, the period between Christ's ascension to heaven and his return to consummate the kingdom that he inaugurated, the distress in that period will fluctuate in keeping with the analogy of labor pains. Right? You might earlier on have right? It's not just a straight thing. You see, so the distress is going to fluctuate. And regarding persecution, the persecution aspect of that distress that is part of the birth pains of the inter-Advent age, Blomberg says, all this does not mean that life for Christians in this world must remain unrelentingly evil, but that in general, due to the opposition of a fallen world to the priorities of God, and even despite the powerful inauguration of his kingdom, people will continue to reject the exclusive message of that kingdom. There is going to be this backdrop of hostility, resentment, the enemy at work, and that's going to break out differentially throughout this period until the coming of the end. 15 to 21. He says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, and then he adds, let the reader understand. All right, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who's on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who's in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. I got to race through this. Hang on. All right, having told them, right, he's just spent the time telling them that wars and all kinds of upheaval and distress will occur without the arrival of the end. So Jesus now applies that, what he's just told them, he applies that to their expectation that the destruction of the temple that he just mentioned will be accompanied by the end. Right? He's just told them, you're going to have all these birth pains, and they won't be accompanied by the end. So he now applies what he just said. That's why it says so, it's therefore, based on what I just told you, right? He's now telling them that, applying that to their expectation that the destruction of the temple that he just mentioned will be accompanied by the end. Given what he has told them, all right, this idea, therefore, so, when they see the abomination of desolation, meaning the abomination that causes desolation, which Luke 21:20 makes clear is Jerusalem coming under attack. Right? You see the parallel in Matthew 24. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Luke says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. The abomination of desolation is Jerusalem being surrounded and being attacked by the Roman armies, these pagan armies who are going to destroy it. And rather than straightening up and raising their heads as they're to do at the time of their redemption at the second coming, as he says in Luke chapter 21, verse 27 and 28, that text we mentioned, where he says, when the second coming is actually happening, well, then it's time to just lift your head. It's here. But that's not the destruction of Jerusalem. I know you think it's tied to the end, but I'm trying to tell you not now. Then is not the time for you to lift your heads and say it's here. No. Then is the time for you to book. You have to flee, and you have to flee immediately, as indicated by the fact that they're not even to stop off at their house or to go back and get their cloak. And this is because the abomination that causes desolation, it signals not the end. as their questions indicate they thought, right? When he mentioned that, they're saying, what's going to be the sign of your coming, the end of the end? It indicates not the end, you see, but rather it is a very severe episode of distress within the age of distress, a particularly sharp birth pain within the birth pains of the Messiah. During this inter-Advent period where we have birth pains that will ultimately give rise to the Lord's coming with the eternal state and the consummated kingdom. No. Don't think that the destruction of Jerusalem is the end. It is only a sharp birth pain. But there will be many others. You see, there will be many others. It's a warning to them not to be fooled into thinking that the attack on Jerusalem was the time of the Lord's promised consummating return. And fleeing the Roman assault on Jerusalem, that would be especially difficult, obviously, on pregnant women, on those with newborns. And it would be more difficult if it occurred in winter or if it occurred on a Sabbath. Winter would make travel more difficult because it would be cold, more likely to be rainy. The Sabbath would make travel more difficult because Jews would be keeping the Sabbath, which would make it much more difficult to buy provisions, much more difficult to get help, and it would also expose the fleeing Christians to the hostility of Jews for traveling further than the prescribed Sabbath distance that you are allowed to travel on the Sabbath. So all of that would complicate. And so he says here, alas, if you're a pregnant mother, you have newborns, pray it won't be in the wintertime or on the Sabbath. Because we're talking about this assault on Jerusalem that is coming and did come in AD 70. And I thought I'd get further than that, but that's how it is. Next week, thanks for coming.